Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a single, absolutely explosive moment in history. We're talking about an event that didn't just redraw the map of an entire nation, it literally changed hearts and minds forever. It's the story of Fort Sumter. This was the spark that ignited a completely divided kingdom, and it's a piece of history that teaches us some incredibly powerful, lasting lessons about communication, leadership, and morality. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. A nation divided, 2. Lincoln's strategic dilemma, 3. The spark of war, and 4. The point of no return. After that, we'll pivot to look beyond the history books with 5. The biblical lesson, and finally, wrap up with 6. Education with morality. Let's get right into it. Section 1. A nation divided. So, let's travel back in time to the year 1860. The United States was, well, it was incredibly fragile. It wasn't this unified, unstoppable powerhouse you might picture. Rather, it was a nation that was beginning to deeply, profoundly fracture under the weight of some very fundamental disagreements. Picture the scene for a second. South Carolina had literally just officially seceded from the United States in December of 1860. They emphatically declared, "We are no longer part of this country." But there was a massive catch that complicated the whole thing. The United States Army was still sitting inside a federal fort right in the middle of their territory, which begs a massive question. Why was Fort Sumter so important that neither side was willing to just walk away? The reality on the ground was incredibly tense. Fort Sumter wasn't just some random brick building on an island. It was basically a masterclass in military positioning. It sat right in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, essentially guarding a crucial southern port. If you controlled Fort Sumter, you fundamentally controlled trade and supplies flowing in and out of one of the South's most important and wealthy cities. But honestly, beyond the strategy, the fort was highly psychological. It stood as this massive physical symbol of Union resistance sitting right in the heart of the newly formed Confederacy. Which brings us to Section 2, Lincoln's strategic dilemma. Now put yourself in the shoes of President Abraham Lincoln. He has literally just taken office. The country is tearing itself apart, and boom, he's immediately facing an impossible, high-stakes decision regarding those Union soldiers trapped inside this highly contested fort. Confederate leaders demanded the U.S. Army leave immediately, but Lincoln, he absolutely refused to abandon the fort. However, his men inside were rapidly running out of food and basic supplies. So if his men are surrounded by a hostile force, you might be wondering, why didn't President Lincoln just send in heavily armed backup and weapons to fight their way out? Well, that leads us to a brilliant strategic puzzle. The genius behind Lincoln's choice all comes down to the optics of the situation. He knew deeply that if he sent swords, cannons, and weapons, it makes the Union look like an invading aggressor. It frames Lincoln as the guy who started a horrific war. But by placing only bread on the scales, just basic provisions for starving men, he completely flips the script. He forces the Confederacy to make the agonizing choice of whether they're going to fire the first shot at unarmed supply boats. By choosing to send only food, Lincoln secured the moral high ground, placing the pressure entirely on the Confederacy to make the first violent move. All right, Section 3, the spark of war. That incredibly tense strategic decision brings us right to the climax of our historical timeline, where the standoff finally ends and words inevitably turn into warfare. We can trace this mounting tension perfectly from start to finish. Starting in December 1860 with South Carolina's secession, the pressure just builds ferociously for months. When Lincoln finally sends those supply ships in April, the Confederates simply do not see it as a humanitarian mission. Not at all. They view the shipment of any supplies as a direct act of aggression against their newly claimed sovereignty. And so, on April 12, 1861, they lit the powder keg. They fired the very first shots of the American Civil War. 34. For 34 agonizing, deafening hours, Confederate forces rained relentless artillery fire down onto Fort Sumter. Just try to imagine the sheer noise shaking the harbor, the thick smoke filling the air, and the absolute terror of a continuous, day-and-a-half-long bombardment. The outgunned Union troops held on as long as they physically could until they finally had absolutely no choice but to surrender the fort. But here is a historical paradox that is just absolutely wild. Despite 34 hours of explosive, relentless bombardment literally tearing the masonry apart, there were 0 casualties in the fighting. Not a single person on either side died during the actual battle for Fort Sumter. It's a stunning fact. But, don't let that zero fool you, because the subsequent damage done to the entire nation was immeasurable. Section 4. The point of no return. While it wasn't the deadliest fight, in fact, like we just said, it was totally bloodless. It was incredibly powerful as a symbol. It was the absolute point of no return that completely hardened the nation's heart. The event fractured the public psyche immediately. The initial attack completely polarized the country, aggressively wiping away any lingering hopes for a peaceful compromise. In the North, citizens viewed the defenders of Fort Sumter as true heroes, making a brave stand against rebellion, and they fiercely demanded war to crush the uprising. Meanwhile, in the South, the attack was viewed as absolute proof that the Confederacy wouldn't be bullied by Washington, and they were officially galvanized and ready to fight. Both sides dug in their heels. The fallout was immediate, like these massive, heavy dominoes falling. Because of those shots fired at Fort Sumter, 4 more states, including immense economic and military powerhouses like Virginia and North Carolina, seceded from the Union. This single 34-hour standoff transformed what could have potentially been a localized Southern rebellion into an unavoidable, devastating, and full-scale national war. Moving on to Section 5, the biblical lesson. History teaches us the facts, the timelines, and the strategies. But the source material for today's explainer challenges us to go a bit further, using a framework of biblical morality to truly understand the deeper lesson here. It's about exploring the why behind the what. Consider the words of Mark chapter 3, verse 24. If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. This timeless truth just perfectly summarizes the tragedy of 1861. It is a striking reminder that division fundamentally weakens nations. It hollows out our communities, and it can even destroy our own families from the inside out. A house built on a fractured foundation will ultimately, inevitably, collapse. Fort Sumter is really the ultimate historical example of ignoring that truth. The Civil War began because of unresolved conflict, unchecked pride, and failed communication. The source material emphasizes that leaders must seek peace, they must speak truth, and they must act with wisdom long before conflict grows beyond repair. True unity isn't just about agreeing on everything. It requires deep humility, a commitment to justice, and most importantly, a genuine willingness to actually listen to one another. So I want you to take a second and really reflect on this question. How can wise communication help prevent conflict from becoming harmful division? Think about this not just in terms of guys in 1861, but in your daily life today. When you have a disagreement with a friend, a coworker, or your family, how can you apply wise communication to de-escalate an argument before it becomes a destructive 34-hour bombardment of your own? And this brings us to Section 6, Education with Morality. Connecting history to our own lives brings us to the core philosophy of this curriculum from HeroesMart Academy. The focus is not just on memorizing old dates, but on seeking practical, real-world wisdom. The HeroesMart Academy Godly Learner series intertwines education directly with biblical morality. Gaining education is step 1, sure, but stopping there leaves you without a compass. Step 2 is combining that knowledge with morality. Because the perspective here is that being smart and educated without a moral framework just leads to brilliant people making deeply flawed, bad choices that end up hurting others. Strategy without morality is exactly what gave us the Civil War. Instead of destruction, the curriculum points to promises like Romans 8:6-7, which promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their mind spiritual. By engaging with history, science, and literature through this specific lens, the goal is to tap into that incredible promise. It's about not just filling the brain with cold facts, but guarding the heart and finding true, enduring peace of mind. The core message of the source material is that when you anchor your learning in morality, you completely change the equation of your life. True education, when combined with a spiritual mind, doesn't lead to conflict. Instead, it replaces the destructive pride and division of the past with lasting, deeply rooted peace for the future. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative challenge to carry with you. Will you use your education and wise communication to build peace, or will you let pride lead to division? The history of Fort Sumter is already written, but your history is happening right now. How will you use your own voice to keep your kingdom standing strong? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.